They mocked her for not speaking, but when the Duke of Blackwell's voice rang out, it stopped them all. Could a single moment rewrite everything for the silent bride and the most coveted bachelor in England? Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. And trust me, you won't want to miss tomorrow's story. So stay tuned. England, 1815. The grand ball at Lord Stanmore's estate was in full swing. The chandeliers that hung from the high ceiling cast a soft, golden glow over the room, illuminating the opulence of the gathering. The air was thick with the sound of laughter, the rustle of silk gowns, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Couples moved gracefully across the polished marble floors, their footsteps synchronized to the music played by the string quartet in the corner. Among the glittering guests, Alice Stanley, the 3-year-old daughter of the Duke of Stanmore, stood silently in the far corner of the ballroom. Her ivory wedding gown, meticulously designed in the latest Regency style, shimmered faintly in the light. The gown, adorned with intricate gold and silver embroidery, should have made her the center of attention, but instead, Alice blended into the shadows, her beauty overshadowed by the silent burden she carried. Alice had never been a typical debutante. Despite her aristocratic heritage and her delicate beauty, her rich chestnut hair styled in an elegant updo, her bright green eyes framed by long lashes, her soft, freckled cheeks, she was far from the object of adoration that most women in her station would be. Society had never fully embraced Alice, for the simple reason that she was deaf. Her inability to hear and speak had made her the subject of pity, and worse, derision. As the daughter of the Duke, she was expected to marry well, to fulfill her role in society as a lady and an eventual mother. Yet, despite her family's high standing, Alice had never been considered a viable match. She had seen the hopeful glances of suitors that would always turn away, and heard the whispered remarks about her imperfection that followed her like a shadow. A woman who cannot speak is hardly fit for the Duke, they would say. Or worse, what man would choose her? Alice had become accustomed to being invisible, relegated to the background of every ball and social gathering she attended. She moved through life as an observer, her presence often unnoticed unless it was to be mocked. The quiet corners of rooms had become her refuge, where she could watch the world spin by, her fingers grasping the edges of her reality. The gentle hum of conversation, the music of the evening, the rustling of skirts. These were all sounds that Alice could never fully experience, yet she longed to. She longed for a connection, for someone to truly see her beyond her silence. Tonight, however, as Alice stood in the shadows of the ballroom, there was a flicker of hope, however fleeting, that someone might. Her gaze drifted across the room, settling on the couples who danced with perfect synchronicity, each twirl of their bodies a testament to the joy of the moment. She watched them with a quiet longing, wishing she could participate in the dance of life, just as they did. But Alice knew her place. She had long ago accepted that she would never dance. Her world was not one of sound, of music, or of conversations filled with witty banter. Instead, it was a world defined by stillness, by silence, where every word she longed to speak went unheard, every thought she longed to share remained trapped within. Tonight was no different. Alice had dressed carefully, choosing a gown that, by all outward appearances, was fit for a grand occasion. Yet, as she stood in the corner, watching the events unfold around her, she felt the weight of her isolation more heavily than ever. Society viewed her as less worthy, less desirable, less capable. At 23, she was already considered a spinster, a woman past her prime, and for all her family's wealth, her title meant nothing in the eyes of the ton. She was simply the silent daughter of the Duke, a figure of pity rather than one of interest. Her brother, Lord Stanmore, was engaged in animated conversation with one of the older gentlemen from the peerage, and her father was nowhere to be seen. Alice was left to navigate the evening alone, as usual. The whispers about her deafness were not new, but tonight they seemed louder, sharper. "Have you noticed?" came the whispered voice of Lady Caroline Whitmore, a socialite of high standing, though known for her tendency to gossip. Alice could see her through the crowd, hidden behind her fan as she leaned toward a companion. "Miss Stanley has made her appearance again this season. A shame, really. One would think after 2 decades of failure, she might accept her fate with dignity." The words pierced Alice like arrows, but she did not flinch. She stood still, her spine straight, her expression calm. It was a practiced defense, one she had honed over the years. Though the sting of the remark settled in her chest, she chose not to react. She had long ago learned the art of pretending she didn't hear. It was easier that way. A sudden shift in the room caught her attention, and she noticed the *** Duke of Blackwell *** George Harold *** entering through the grand doors. The Duke's presence was enough to make the crowd pause, their attention drawn to him like moths to a flame. At 31, George was one of the most eligible bachelors in England, his title, wealth, and charisma, making him the subject of every matchmaking mother's dreams. He moved with a grace and confidence that commanded respect, his striking appearance only adding to the aura of mystery that surrounded him. His dark brown hair, styled in the latest fashion, framed his strong jawline, and his deep-set eyes, whether blue or brown, depending on the light, held a keen intelligence that seemed to see through people. But what set George apart was not only his appearance or wealth, it was his notorious reputation for rejecting every eligible lady that had been presented to him. He had refused countless proposals, causing society to speculate on his reasons. Many believed he was simply waiting for the perfect match, though none could quite agree on what that might be. As George scanned the room, his eyes briefly met Alice's. It was only for a moment, an instant that seemed to stretch, to linger longer than it should have. Alice's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly looked away, her face flushed. But something in the way George's gaze held hers made her pause. Was it possible that he had seen her, truly seen her, beyond her silence? Or was it merely another passing glance, one that would fade into the many that had come before? George Harold had always lived by his own rules. Raised in the lap of luxury and accustomed to the privileges of his title, he had become disillusioned with the shallowness of society's expectations. His numerous rejections of eligible women had made him a subject of constant gossip, but George was unmoved. The women presented to him were always perfect in beauty, lineage, and accomplishment, but he found none of them interesting. None had captured his heart or piqued his intellect. George was a man of depth, searching for a woman who could not only meet him intellectually, but also challenge him, someone who could see beyond his title and fortune. The ballroom was filled with women who paraded their beauty for the sake of a title, but none of them had ever spoken to him in a way that made him think differently about the world. Tonight, as his gaze fell on Alice Stanley, something stirred within him. For the first time, he saw a woman who wasn't vying for his attention, who wasn't trying to capture his heart through superficial charms. He saw Alice standing alone, a picture of quiet dignity, and in that moment, George felt a connection, a recognition of something rare and precious. She wasn't like the others. Alice's eyes met his once more, and for a fleeting moment, he saw vulnerability, strength, and grace all intertwined. It was as though in the silence between them, there was a conversation that needed no words. The evening continued around them, the music swelling in the background, but for Alice and George, the world had paused. Neither of them spoke, but in the space between them, something had shifted. Something profound had begun to take root, unnoticed by the guests who swirled around them in their own worlds of sound and chatter. For Alice, the idea that anyone, let alone the Duke of Blackwell, might see her for who she truly was, seemed impossible. But in that brief, silent exchange, it felt, for the first time in her life, as though it was within reach. As the evening wore on, Alice stood at the edge of the room, her heart pounding, hoping that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not as invisible as she had always believed. And in the back of her mind, a question lingered. Could this man, the most sought-after bachelor in England, see something in her that no one else had ever noticed? Could he see her not as the deaf, silent daughter of the Duke, but as Alice Stanley, a woman of quiet strength, grace, and dignity? And so, for the first time in years, Alice allowed herself to hope. Chapter 2. The Duke's Attention. The music in Lord Stanmore's ballroom swelled again, a soft, lilting waltz that filled the room with its gentle rhythm. The guests glided across the floor, their silk and satin gowns flowing in perfect harmony with the melody. Alice stood motionless in her corner, her hands clasped together in front of her, watching the couples move effortlessly as though they had been born to dance. Her gaze was drawn to the center of the floor, where the most eligible men and women of London twirled with practiced grace. Alice had often dreamed of participating in such dances, of feeling the music run through her veins as she spun across the room with her partner. But the reality was that for Alice, these grand balls were merely something to observe from the sidelines. She had long given up any hope of finding someone who might see past her silence, someone who would dare to invite her into this world where sound reigned supreme. Her green eyes shifted restlessly as the night wore on, her thoughts moving from one longing to the next. Asterisk, asterisk, George Harold, the Duke of Blackwell, asterisk, asterisk, was not far from her thoughts. Since their brief exchange earlier, when his gaze had met hers across the ballroom, she had thought of little else. The Duke was a man of great standing, and Alice could not help but wonder if he had seen something in her, perhaps the same dignity and grace that had captivated him in the first place. Or perhaps it was nothing more than a fleeting glance. But now, as she stood silently against the wall, she felt a shift in the air, a sudden change in the energy of the room. A whisper of movement caught her eye, and she looked up just as the Duke of Blackwell himself made his way toward her. Alice's breath caught in her chest as she saw George make his way through the crowd. His tall, commanding figure cut through the sea of guests, his dark hair falling neatly to the side, his posture regal yet relaxed. There was an ease in his movements, a confidence that made him appear almost untouchable. The room seemed to part for him, as though they all knew the Duke was accustomed to taking center stage wherever he went. But as he drew nearer to Alice, something in his expression softened. His eyes met hers once more, and for a brief moment, the noise and movement of the ballroom seemed to fade away. He stopped before her, his gaze steady and warm, an unreadable expression in his dark eyes. "Miss Stanley," he said, his voice deep and smooth, though Alice could not hear it. She could read his lips with practiced ease. "Might I have the honor of this dance?" A stunned silence fell over the room. Alice's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she felt the weight of every eye in the room upon her. The Duke of Blackwell, England's most eligible bachelor, the man who had turned down every eligible woman who had come before him, was asking her, the silent daughter of the Duke of Stanmore, to dance. The world around her seemed to pause as she stood there, frozen, her thoughts swirling like the waltz that filled the room. The weight of society's judgment crashed down on her all at once. Alice's face flushed with the sudden awareness of every whispered word, every cruel remark, every sneer she had ever encountered. Could she truly accept? Could she put herself out there to be ridiculed once more by the ton? For a moment, Alice felt as if the room were closing in on her, the laughter of her peers echoing in her ears. She wanted to say no, to retreat into the safety of her solitude, where no one could judge her. But then, something inside her stirred a quiet, trembling hope, a yearning she had long suppressed. Alice stood still for a long moment, unsure of what to do. She glanced at George, his hand extended toward her, in an offer that seemed so simple, so sincere. His calm, steady gaze never wavered, and there was no hint of mockery in his expression, no trace of disdain. For the first time in years, Alice felt as though someone might actually be seeing her, not as the woman who could not speak, but as someone worthy of attention. But the weight of the ballroom's collective gaze was almost unbearable. She could already hear the whispers, the shock, the disbelief. The Duke of all men choosing her, a deaf woman. The tongue would certainly not let her forget it. It would be the subject of every drawing-room conversation, every whispered gossip at the next soiree. Was it worth the humiliation? The conflict within her was a tempest. She had long grown accustomed to being ignored, to living in the shadows. To say yes would be to step into the light, to allow herself to be seen in a way she had never allowed herself before. She could already feel the stares, the judgment bearing down on her. But then something shifted. George's gaze never left hers, and though she couldn't hear his voice, his body language spoke volumes. There was no mockery in him, no condescension, no impatience. He was simply waiting for her response, patiently and without hesitation. In that moment, Alice realized something she had nothing to lose. She had spent too long standing on the sidelines of life, watching others experience what she had only dreamed of. Perhaps it was time to finally take a step forward, to seize the chance, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, Alice made her decision. She placed her trembling hand into George's, feeling the warmth of his touch. For a fleeting moment, the weight of the world lifted, and she allowed herself to be led onto the dance floor. The moment she stepped into the circle of guests, she could feel the tension in the air, like the tightening of a noose. The music played, the violins soaring through the room, but Alice could barely hear it. Her feet moved with George's, guided by his steady hand at her waist. Her pulse raced, but it wasn't from fear, it was from something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: excitement. But as the couple took their first steps, the laughter from the onlookers began. Alice could feel the weight of their gazes, the disbelief, the ridicule. She could imagine the whispered remarks, the quick glances, the shaking heads, and yet George's presence at her side was a steadying force, a quiet anchor that kept her grounded. "You realize," Alice murmured, her voice barely audible above the music, "that you have just scandalized the entire assembly." "So," George, unfazed, smiled slightly. "Have I? I thought I was simply dancing with the most interesting woman in the room." The tension in Alice's chest eased just a little, and she found herself smiling in return, despite the weight of the world on her shoulders. For the first time, she felt as though she was not being judged by her silence, but by her presence alone. And with George at her side, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she could hold her head high, even in the face of ridicule. As the dance continued, Alice's thoughts raced. She was so used to being invisible, to being overlooked. Her silence, something she had once considered a flaw, had often made her feel like a shadow in a world of sound. It was easier to retreat, to stay out of the spotlight, to protect herself from the harsh judgments of those around her. But now, as she moved in time with George, something was different. She was still Alice Stanley, the silent daughter of the Duke, but for the first time, she felt seen, truly seen, by someone who did not care about her silence. It was not just the dance, it was the way George had asked her, the way he had looked at her as though she mattered. She wasn't just a woman who could not speak. She was someone worthy of being asked to dance by the Duke himself. But as much as Alice tried to bask in the moment, the whispers of the ton were never far from her mind. They would never let her forget her perceived shortcomings. She would always be the woman who could not speak, the woman whose silence defined her. Still, as she danced with George, something began to shift within her. His touch was gentle, his hand firm and reassuring at her waist, and for the first time in years, Alice began to believe that perhaps her silence was not a weakness. Perhaps, in the right hands, it could be her strength. As they twirled together, their steps in perfect sync, Alice allowed herself a single, fleeting thought. Maybe this was the start of something new, something she had never dared hope for. Maybe, in George's eyes, she was more than her silence. Maybe, just maybe, she was enough. The waltz continued, the music flowing like a river through the room, but for Alice and George, the world had shrunk to a small corner of the ballroom, where the only thing that mattered was the quiet connection between them. And as the dance came to an end, Alice found herself wishing it could last forever. Chapter 3. The Roses. The morning after the ball, Alice awoke with a feeling of unease settling deep within her chest. The sounds of London's bustling streets outside her window were muffled by the heavy curtains in her room, and the soft light of dawn filtered through the fabric, casting gentle shadows across the floor. The events of the night before, her unexpected dance with George Harold, the Duke of Blackwell, felt like a dream, one that seemed too surreal to fully grasp. Had it really happened? Had he really asked her to dance in front of all those people? Alice could still feel the warmth of his hand at her waist, the way his eyes had looked at her not with pity, as she had often been met with, but with something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. But now, in the quiet of the morning, the weight of the world felt heavy again. The whispers, the judgment, the doubt, they were all back, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. She had always known that society would never fully accept her. She was the silent daughter of the Duke, an outsider in a world that revered beauty, sound, and speech. And yet, George's attention, his kindness, lingered in her thoughts. Alice sighed, rising from the bed and moving toward the large, ornate mirror that stood in the corner of her room. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and uncertain. She could still feel the sting of society's mockery, and yet something inside her stirred a glimmer of hope, however small. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Stanley," came the voice of her maid. Asterisk, asterisk, Catherine, asterisk, asterisk, through the door. "There is a delivery for you." Alice furrowed her brow. A delivery? Who would be sending her anything this early in the morning? She opened the door, and Catherine stepped in, holding a large vase in her hands. Her eyes widened as she approached Alice, placing the vase carefully on the small table by the window. "Crimson roses, miss. A whole bouquet," Catherine said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "From the Duke of Blackwell, it seems." Alice's heart skipped a beat. The Duke? Why would he send her roses? She stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the bouquet. They were the most exquisite roses she had ever seen, rich crimson petals that glowed in the morning light, their fragrance sweet and heady. But it was the note attached to the bouquet that took her breath away. She reached for the card, her hands trembling slightly as she read the words written in a bold, elegant script. Asterisk, to a lady who speaks with more grace than words could ever convey. George Harold, Duke of Blackwell. Asterisk. The words were simple, yet they felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in her life, someone had acknowledged not just her silence, but the strength it took to live with it. A sense of warmth spread through Alice's chest, and she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. Hope that perhaps she was more than her silence, more than the woman society had relegated to the sidelines. "Is there a mistake?" Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though still unsure that the gesture was real. "I don't think so, miss," Catherine replied, her voice filled with surprise. "I asked the delivery man, and he confirmed it was from the Duke himself." Alice's mind raced, her heart still pounding in her chest. Why would the Duke, of all people, send her flowers? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Alice had heard the whispers at the ball, the incredulous remarks, the shocked faces. She knew she was the subject of their gossip, their amusement. But this was different. This was not the Duke's usual detachment, nor was it a simple courtesy. This was something more. The roses didn't just surprise Alice, they shocked her family as well. Her father, the Duke of Stanmore, was seated at the breakfast table when the bouquet was brought to him, still fresh with the scent of the flowers. His expression was one of mild curiosity as he glanced at the vase, then back at Alice. "Alice," he said, setting down his coffee, "what is this? Did you receive a gift?" Alice felt the weight of his gaze on her, but she said nothing, only handed him the card. Her father read it silently, then glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "I presume this is from the Duke of Blackwell?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, father," Alice replied, her voice shaking slightly. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Her father's sharp eyes studied her, though his face remained unreadable. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Well, this is unexpected." Her mother, Lady Stanmore, who had been busy arranging the morning tea, looked over with a raised eyebrow. "Crimson roses, no less," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. "The Duke does not send flowers to just anyone." Alice lowered her gaze, suddenly feeling as though she were under a microscope. "It was a kind gesture," she replied softly, trying to explain the inexplicable. "A kind gesture?" Her mother's tone was sharp. "Alice, the Duke is one of the most sought-after bachelors in the kingdom. His attention to you, his public display of interest will cause a stir. Do you understand the implications of this?" I didn't ask for it," Alice murmured, her gaze falling to the floor. "I'm sure you didn't," Lady Stanmore replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "But it seems, my dear, that you are not the only one who has noticed your silence." Alice's face burned with embarrassment. She could feel her mother's judgment, the subtle mockery in her words. She had long been the subject of her family's disappointment, their frustration that she could not fulfill the role they had so carefully crafted for her in society. A daughter who could neither speak nor marry into an advantageous match was seen as a failure, no matter how dignified her silence. "What did he mean by grace?" her father asked, his voice softer now, though still filled with the weight of expectation. "I believe he means that my silence, though it may seem a flaw to others, is something I carry with dignity," Alice said quietly, though she was unsure of how to explain herself further. The words felt foreign on her tongue, and yet they were the truth. She had lived her entire life in a world where silence was seen as weakness, but in that one note, George had given her something she had never had: validation. Her father didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the roses again, then set the card down on the table. "You will need to be careful, Alice. Society is watching. The Duke's attention will not go unnoticed. Across town, **, George Harold, Duke of Blackwell ***, sat in his study, a glass of brandy in hand as he stared at the fire crackling before him. The gesture of sending the roses had been impulsive, but something about Alice Stanley had stirred him in ways he hadn't expected. He had spent most of his life avoiding marriage, rejecting the perfect matches presented to him by his family, his peers, and society at large. But with Alice, it was different. She had been so poised, so graceful at the ball. Despite her silence, she held herself with an ease that no other woman seemed to possess. There was a quiet dignity about her that was rare, and George found himself drawn to it, almost helplessly. For weeks now, George had observed Alice from afar, but he had never quite known what it was about her that captivated him. She wasn't the most beautiful woman in the room. There were many women more stunning than she, more fashionable, more well-spoken. Yet Alice had something that made her stand apart, something he hadn't been able to define until now. As he sat there, contemplating his feelings for Alice, George realized that what drew him to her wasn't her outward beauty, but her strength. Her silence, which so many saw as a flaw, had become her greatest strength in his eyes. She moved through a world that demanded words, demanded performance, and yet she remained herself quiet, composed, and unfaltering. That strength, that quiet grace was something he could not ignore. And so, in a moment of clarity, George knew that he had to see Alice again, to make sure she knew he saw her for who she truly was, not the silent daughter, but a woman of quiet power, deserving of far more than society had ever given her. For once, George Harold was not interested in what society thought. He was interested in Alice Stanley, and he would not let her go unnoticed any longer. As Alice continued through the day, her thoughts were consumed by the roses, by the Duke's words, and by the undeniable pull she felt toward him. For the first time in her life, someone had looked past her silence and seen her for the person she truly was. She didn't know what it meant yet, or what the future might hold, but for once, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, George Harold saw her not as a mute woman, but as someone worthy of attention. And as for George, he had already decided that this was only the beginning. He had seen enough to know that Alice was someone he could never forget. Chapter 4. The Ballroom Confrontation, Public Mockery. The next gathering was one that Alice had been dreading, though she did not show it. Another ball, another round of forced smiles, polite conversation, and glances that said everything without saying a word. As the daughter of the Duke of Stanmore, Alice had no choice but to attend, to fulfill her role in society, despite the crushing weight of her invisibility. The whispering, the sneers, the whispered remarks, she had grown accustomed to them all. It was as if she were a ghost, present in the room but never truly seen. Tonight, the ballroom was grander than usual, its towering columns draped with lush greenery, candles glowing warmly from every corner. Yet, despite the beauty of the setting, Alice's heart felt heavy in her chest. She moved through the crowd with a grace born of years of practice, her silence a constant companion. As the waltz played, the world spun around her, and she stood, as always, on the periphery. She had learned long ago that if she did not draw attention to herself, others would not do so either. The dance of society continued without her, and she had long resigned herself to this fate. It was not just the lack of a dance partner that weighed on Alice's spirit. It was the cruel mockery she could feel from all around her, the whispers about her silence, the pity, the hidden laughter that came with every glance. It was as if her deafness was the only thing people saw when they looked at her. Tonight was no different. As Alice stood near the refreshment table, pretending to examine the assortment of delicacies, she overheard Lady Caroline Whitmore that ever-curious socialite, speaking in hushed tones to her companion. "Poor Alice Stanley," Lady Caroline said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that she can't even speak? How dreadfully tragic for the daughter of a duke, and at her age too. What man would want a wife who cannot even utter a word?" Alice's breath hitched. The words were like daggers, each one aimed precisely at her heart. She clenched her fingers tightly around the delicate lace of her gown, her chest tightening with the familiar sting of humiliation. The whisper grew louder, and Alice knew Lady Caroline's words had not been meant to remain private. "Do you think she understands how absurd she looks?" her companion replied, equally quiet, though the words still managed to wound Alice. A woman who cannot speak, a duke's daughter, reduced to being a mere observer in a world of speech and dance. How dreadfully sad. Alice's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she held herself firm, pushing down the rising tide of tears that threatened to betray her composure. She knew they spoke of her, and they always would. Her silence had become her greatest flaw in the eyes of society, an imperfection that no amount of grace or dignity could ever erase. The music seemed to mock her as the waltz continued to play, a reminder of what she could never participate in. She felt the eyes of the ballroom on her, and it was as if the weight of their judgment crushed her chest. How much longer could she endure this? How much longer could she stand in silence, watching the world move on without her? And then, through the crowd, she saw him. George Harold, the Duke of Blackwell, entered the ballroom with his usual air of grace and authority, his presence commanding attention from every corner of the room. His black and gold tailcoat shimmered in the candlelight, his dark hair neatly combed, and his expression unreadable. Alice's heart skipped a beat, and she could feel her breath catch in her throat. George had been a distant figure in her life until recently, a man who had seemed far beyond her reach. But now, his eyes, those piercing dark eyes, met hers across the room, and for a brief moment, the weight of society's whispers seemed to fade. There was something in his gaze, something that made Alice feel for the first time in her life that perhaps she wasn't invisible. But before she could fully process the thought, the moment was shattered by the continued gossip from the crowd around her. Alice's gaze dropped to the floor as she struggled to keep her composure. She felt as though she were drowning in the sounds of mockery and judgment. She tried to step away, to retreat into the quiet corners of the ballroom where she could escape their scrutiny, but fate had other plans. As she made her way toward the edge of the room, she suddenly heard a deep voice, strong and commanding. "Miss Stanley," George Harold's voice rang out, cutting through the noise of the ballroom. Alice froze, her body stiffening at the sound of his voice. She slowly turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. He stood before her, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" George asked, his gaze unwavering. A stunned silence fell over the room. The murmurs died down, replaced by sharp intakes of breath and curious glances. Alice's heart raced. This was no ordinary request. This was the Duke, the most sought-after bachelor in England, asking her, a woman who could not speak, to dance. Alice opened her mouth to decline, to make some excuse, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to say no. She wanted to retreat into the shadows, away from the gaze of the ton. But something in George's steady gaze, something in the calmness of his demeanor, made her hesitate. With a deep breath, Alice placed her trembling hand in his. She felt a shiver run through her, and though she couldn't hear the music, she knew what was about to happen. The room held its collective breath, and the Duke of Blackwell, known for his refusal to dance with anyone, was now leading Alice Stanley, silent, unspoken, and misunderstood, onto the dance floor. As they took their first steps together, Alice could feel the weight of every eye in the room upon her. The whispers began again, louder this time, and Alice braced herself for the onslaught of ridicule. How could she, a woman who could not speak, dance with the most eligible man in all of England? How could he, the Duke, be seen with her, the silent daughter of a duke? But then, as the dance continued, something changed. Alice had always expected to be the object of mockery, the one who was judged and dismissed. But as George led her across the floor with ease, his hand at her waist steady and sure, something remarkable happened. The laughter, the whispers, the cruel remarks, they all began to fade into the background. George's calm presence was a balm to her soul. He did not see her silence as something to be mocked or pitied. He saw her, truly saw her, as a woman who could dance without speaking a word, who could move through the world with grace and dignity, despite the limitations placed on her by society. And in that moment, Alice realized something profound. She wasn't defined by her silence. She wasn't defined by what others thought of her. She was defined by who she was inside, by the strength that had carried her through years of judgment and isolation. As they danced, she felt a surge of emotion rise within her, a mixture of gratitude and wonder. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen her not for her ability to speak, not for her title, but for who she was as a person. When the dance finally came to an end, the room still held its breath, waiting for Alice to retreat. But she didn't. For the first time she stood tall, her heart no longer burdened by the weight of the ton's expectations. George had defended her with his actions, and in doing so, he had given her something far more valuable than a dance. He had given her the freedom to finally believe in her own worth. The crowd stood still, unsure of what to make of the scene they had just witnessed. But Alice, for the first time in her life, didn't care. She had been seen, truly seen, by the one person who mattered. As the whispers began to fade, Alice looked up at George, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. She may have been silent, but she was no longer invisible. And as the music faded into the background, Alice knew that this was just the beginning of something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 5. The Proposal in the Garden. The evening air was cool against Alice's skin as she stepped into the Duke of Blackwell's private garden, the soft scent of roses mingling with the earthy fragrance of damp soil. The garden, an expansive space of manicured hedges and blooming flowers, seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, untouched by the formalities of the ballroom or the whispers of society. Here, in the quiet solitude of the garden, Alice felt an unexpected sense of peace. She had retreated to this place, seeking refuge from the suffocating scrutiny of the ballroom. After the dance with George, she had been swarmed with questions, stares, and whispered comments. For the first time, however, those comments had not pierced her as deeply. The world had not disappeared, but it had become smaller, and in that small space, there was only one thing that mattered: George's presence. She had come to the garden in search of clarity, but as she wandered deeper into the maze of flowers, her thoughts were still a tangle of confusion. How could it be possible that the Duke of Blackwell, the most eligible man in England, was interested in her? A woman who could not speak, who had lived in the shadows for so long. Just as she reached a secluded corner of the garden, where the roses bloomed in riotous colors, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. She turned to find George, his tall frame silhouetted against the soft evening light. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he moved toward her, steady and sure, that made Alice's heart quicken. "Miss Stanley." George's voice was low, but Alice could read the words as easily as if they had been spoken aloud. "I hope I'm not intruding." "No," Alice replied, her voice soft yet steady. "I was just taking in the garden." George smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made Alice's heart flutter despite herself. "It's a lovely place to think," he said, stepping closer to her. He paused for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully. "I've spent a great deal of time here myself." Alice tilted her head slightly, curious. "Why here?" George's expression softened as he looked around the garden, his eyes lingering on the vibrant flowers that surrounded them. "Because it's the only place where I can escape the expectations of the world," he replied, his voice tinged with quiet melancholy. "For years, I've been surrounded by people who only see my title, my wealth. No one has ever looked beyond that to see who I really am, to understand the person I am beneath all of it." Alice's heart ached at his words. She had spent much of her life feeling invisible, hidden behind her silence. And yet, here was a man who, despite his power, his position, and his charm, felt just as trapped by society's expectations as she did. There was a shared understanding between them, one that neither had ever spoken aloud before. "I've turned down every match," George continued, his voice growing quieter, more introspective. "Not because the women were not beautiful, or accomplished, or well-connected, but because none of them saw me, not truly. They all saw the Duke of Blackwell, but not the man behind the title. And I've been running from it. Running from the idea of marrying someone who would never know me." Alice felt a swell of emotion in her chest as she listened to his confession. She could sense the pain behind his words, the burden he carried despite his status. And yet, here he was, opening up to her, this woman who could not speak, this woman who had been shunned by society for her silence. "You see me," Alice said softly, her words quiet but steady. She looked into George's eyes, hoping her sincerity would come through. "Not for my silence, not for my family, but for who I am." George's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. The air seemed to hum with something electric, something palpable. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You are everything I have been searching for, Alice. You are the one who sees me, not the title, not the wealth. You see me for who I truly am, and I cannot ignore that any longer." Alice's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected this, had never allowed herself to dream of such a moment. But now, with his hand in hers, with his words hanging in the air between them, she realized that everything had shifted. She had always feared being rejected, being invisible, but in this moment, she was neither. She was seen, truly seen. Asterisk, asterisk, the proposal. Asterisk, asterisk. George's voice was a soft whisper, yet it felt like the world itself was holding its breath as he spoke. Alice Stanley, will you do me the honor of marrying me? Not because of my title, but because of who you are, because of your strength, your grace, your silence that speaks louder than words ever could. Alice's heart raced, her chest tightening with emotion. The words she had never allowed herself to dream of hearing were now spoken aloud, and they echoed in her mind like a melody she had long since forgotten. He wanted her. Not for her title, not for her silence, but for the woman she was, silent and strong, quiet yet profound. She looked up at George, her green eyes meeting his, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel like an outsider. She did not feel like the silent daughter of the Duke, lost in the shadows. She felt like Alice Stanley, someone worthy of love, worthy of connection, worthy of being seen. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. But George gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away the tear with a tenderness that took her breath away. "Say yes, Alice," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Say yes, and make me the happiest man in the world." Alice swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. She had always feared that love would never find her, that her silence would forever stand between her and the world. But in George's arms, she realized that love didn't need words. It didn't need the validation of society. It only needed truth. "Yes," she breathed, her voice soft but firm. "Yes, George, I will marry you." The moment the words left her lips, George's face broke into a smile so wide, so full of joy, that it seemed to light up the entire garden. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as though he had waited for this moment his entire life. And for Alice, the world felt different. The silence that had once separated her from everything now seemed to be filled with the promise of a new beginning, a beginning she had never thought possible. As George held her, his warmth surrounding her, Alice felt something stir within her. It was a feeling she had never known before, one that made her heart swell with hope. This was not just the beginning of a new chapter in her life, it was the beginning of something she had always longed for. For years, Alice had lived in the shadows of her own silence, convinced that she was unworthy of love, unworthy of being seen. But now, in George's arms, she realized that her silence did not define her. It was her strength, her grace, her ability to hold herself with dignity despite the harshness of the world. And in George, she had found someone who saw her for who she truly was, someone who loved her not in spite of her silence, but because of it. "I've never known what it is to truly be seen," Alice whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. "But now, I understand. I understand what it means to be loved, to be accepted." George kissed her forehead, his lips lingering against her skin as he spoke softly. "You are everything I have ever wanted, Alice. You are my heart, my soul, my future, and I promise you, I will never make you feel invisible again." As the two of them stood there in the quiet of the garden, surrounded by the scent of roses and the gentle rustling of leaves, Alice realized that this was not just a proposal. It was a promise of a love that would defy society's expectations, a love that would survive in silence and strength. And in that moment, Alice knew that her life was about to change forever. She was no longer the silent daughter of the Duke of Stanmore. She was Alice Stanley, the woman who had been seen, the woman who had been loved, and the woman who had found a new beginning with the man who cherished her for everything she was. The future, once a distant dream, was now within reach, and Alice could not wait to embrace it. Chapter 6. The Wedding and Public Reaction. The days leading up to Alice's wedding to George Harold and the Duke of Blackwell were filled with both excitement and quiet trepidation. While the prospect of marrying George, a man she had come to love and trust deeply, filled her with warmth and joy, there was still a shadow that lingered, one cast by society's judgment. The world, with all its expectations and rules, would never quite let her go, and as the wedding day drew nearer, Alice could not shake the feeling of being an outsider in her own life. Alice paced the floors of her chambers, her eyes occasionally drifting to the windows that overlooked the carefully manicured gardens of her father's estate. The room was beautiful, filled with soft silks, fine wood, and delicate lace, but Alice could hardly focus on the details of her surroundings. The gown she had chosen for the ceremony, a regal creation of ivory, satin, and lace, lay across the bed, awaiting the moment when it would transform her into a bride. But in the stillness of the room, Alice's thoughts betrayed her. She had always been the silent daughter of the Duke, marked by her deafness, always set apart from the world. And though George had shown her love, sincerity, and kindness beyond measure, Alice feared that no amount of affection could shield her from the harsh whispers of the ton. The thought of their eyes on her, their judgment, lingering as they watched her marry the most eligible bachelor in England, a woman of silence, still unsettled her. For years, she had been invisible in society's eyes, relegated to the corners of rooms, never considered a worthy partner for any man, let alone one with such a prominent title as George. Now, she was to be the center of attention at a wedding that would be talked about for years. The audacity of the union, a duke marrying the silent daughter of a duke, a woman who could not speak, whose place in society had always been questioned, would be impossible for society to ignore. She sat down at the vanity, her fingers lightly brushing the delicate combs and pins that would adorn her hair. Her reflection in the mirror was a mixture of excitement and doubt, her bright green eyes searching her own face as if for the answers to questions she could not yet voice. The truth was, Alice had spent so long hiding from the world, so long convincing herself that she was unworthy of love or recognition, that this moment felt almost unreal. How could it be that someone like George Harold a man who could have anyone, had chosen her? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Alice's maid, Catherine stepped inside. She smiled at Alice's troubled expression, her eyes soft with understanding. "Miss Stanley," Catherine said gently, "your grace is waiting. The carriage will be here shortly." The mention of George made Alice's heart race. His unwavering support, his belief in her when no one else had, was the reason she could stand here today, about to become his wife. George had never once made her feel less than she was. In his eyes, she had always been enough. He had shown her the truth. Her silence was not a weakness, but a strength that he admired. Alice stood, her heart settling as she took a deep breath, straightening the lace veil that hung from the mirror. With one last glance at her reflection, she felt ready. She might have been unsure of what society would think, but she knew this. She had found someone who saw her for who she was, someone who valued her far beyond the limitations the world had placed upon her. That thought, more than anything, gave her the strength to face the day. The ceremony was held at St. George's Chapel, a breathtakingly beautiful church, where the walls seemed to echo with the voices of past generations. The grand doors stood open, allowing the soft light of the morning sun to spill in, bathing the pews and stained glass windows in a warm, golden hue. The church was filled with flowers, the scent of roses and lilies heavy in the air. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the stillness before the union, adding to the grandeur of the moment. Alice had never been one for grand displays, but as she stood at the altar, her arm looped with her father's, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She knew that this was the moment that would change everything. Today, she was no longer the silent daughter, no longer the woman defined by the limitations of her silence. Today, she was Alice Stanley, the bride of George Harold, the Duke of Blackwell. Her father's grip on her arm was strong, though she could feel the weight of his uncertainty. The Duke had always been a man of tradition, a man who valued the expectations of society. Alice knew he was apprehensive about the union, unsure of how their peers would receive it. Though he had never voiced it directly, she could feel his concern in the way he held her arm with almost protective fervor. As they reached the altar, Alice's gaze drifted toward George standing tall and regal in his dark tailcoat, his expression unreadable. His eyes met hers, and in that instant she saw something in him, a quiet understanding, a certainty that made her breath catch. This was not just a union of title, of family names and societal expectations. This was a union of hearts, of two people who had seen each other in the quietest of ways and had chosen one another despite all odds. The ceremony began, and Alice's heart swelled with emotion as the priest spoke the vows that would bind her to George for the rest of her life. The soft murmur of voices around her seemed distant, like a dream that was out of reach. It was just her and George, and the world outside of that moment faded away. "Do you, George Harold, take Alice Stanley to be your lawful wedded wife?" the priest asked. George's voice was strong, his words clear as he replied, "I do." Then it was her turn. "Do you, Alice Stanley, take George Harold to be your lawful wedded husband?" the priest inquired. Alice's heart thundered in her chest. For a moment, she was still, her mind racing with the weight of the moment. She had always feared that she would never be enough for anyone, that her silence would keep her from experiencing the love she had always longed for. But now, standing here before George, she realized that her silence was not a barrier to love. It was the very thing that had brought them together. With a deep breath, Alice nodded, her lips forming the words she could not speak. "I do." The ceremony continued, and when George placed the ring on her finger, Alice felt as though the entire world had shifted beneath her feet. This was her new beginning. This was her truth, and in George's eyes, she had found the home she had always sought. The reception that followed the ceremony was grand, held in the Duke of Stanmore's estate, and guests poured in from all over London to witness the union. The ballroom was filled with opulent decorations, laughter, and clinking glasses. Alice, in her delicate gown of ivory, satin, and lace, stood beside George, her heart still racing from the whirlwind of the ceremony. But as much as Alice had hoped to escape society's gaze, she could feel it weighing on her. The guests, some familiar, others strangers, looked upon her with mixed reactions. Some were clearly shocked, their whispers too loud, their stares too sharp. Others seemed impressed by George's bravery in choosing her, the woman who had long been cast aside by society. The boldness of their union, a duke marrying a deaf woman, was enough to stir a quiet curiosity in some, though many remained unsure of how to regard her. Lady Caroline Whitmore who had made no attempt to hide her disdain for Alice before, was now watching her with open curiosity. Her eyes flicked from Alice to George, and though her lips were sealed, her expression said everything. It was a mix of disbelief and envy. Envy that someone who was once considered unworthy had captured the attention of the man everyone coveted. But Alice, for the first time in her life, did not care. She was no longer the silent woman in the corner, the object of pity or mockery. Today, she was George's wife, and in his eyes, she was more than enough. She would no longer allow society's expectations to define her. If George could see her for who she truly was, then that was all that mattered. As the evening wore on, the guests began to settle into the rhythm of the reception. There were toasts, laughter, and music. But amidst it all, Alice found herself in a quiet corner with George, his hand resting gently on her arm. "You've made me the happiest man in the world," he whispered to her, his voice soft and sincere. Alice smiled, her heart full. "And you've made me feel seen," she replied, her eyes shining with gratitude. "For the first time, I feel whole." And in that moment, as they stood together, the weight of society's judgment faded completely. The world could whisper, could gossip, could try to tear them apart, but Alice knew the truth. She had found love, not because of her title, not because of her silence, but because of who she was and who George saw her to be. This was only the beginning of their journey together, and Alice was ready to embrace it, come what may. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft amber glow across the quiet landscape as the carriage carrying George Harold Duke of Blackwell, and his new bride, Alice Stanley, the Duchess of Blackwell, rolled steadily toward the secluded country estate where they would begin their life together. The honeymoon that followed their wedding had been a carefully planned retreat, a chance to escape the judgmental eyes of society and bask in the newfound intimacy that had blossomed between them. As the days passed at their private retreat, Alice slowly began to realize how much she had longed for the simplicity of moments like this, the quiet, private moments spent with George, away from the expectations and whispers of the ton. They had always been surrounded by others, both before and after their wedding, but now, here, alone together, Alice felt as though she was beginning to truly understand the depth of their connection. The vast estate, tucked away among rolling hills and thick groves of ancient oak trees, provided the perfect backdrop for the start of their married life. The house, a stately manor built in the Georgian style, was surrounded by manicured gardens, and the air was filled with the sounds of birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was here that George and Alice could be free, unburdened by the weight of societal expectations. In the mornings, they would often take long walks through the gardens, strolling along the cobbled paths that wound through the rose bushes, lavender, and wildflowers. George would tell Alice about his travels across Europe, his studies of art, and the many books he had read over the years. His deep, resonant voice filled the air, drawing Alice into a world that she had always longed to understand, but had never quite fit into. Their conversations were full of mutual respect, curiosity, and a growing admiration for one another. Alice, who had always been cautious about her silence, found herself opening up more and more, sharing her own thoughts about literature, art, and the beauty of nature. Her thoughts, once locked away in the quiet recesses of her mind, flowed freely between them, and George listened with a kind of attentiveness that made her feel understood, truly understood. No longer did she feel the need to hide behind her silence. With George, her words were not an obstacle. They were a bridge that connected them in ways she had never experienced before. One evening, after dinner, George suggested they read together. He had a selection of books by authors Alice had never heard of, and they began to explore them, their discussions evolving into late-night conversations about philosophy and the meaning of life. Alice was surprised at how natural it felt to engage in such deep discussions with George. She had spent so many years feeling disconnected from the intellectual world, but here, in the quiet of their home, her thoughts had found a voice. George was patient and kind, never rushing her or making her feel inadequate for not always being able to articulate herself in the way she wished. Their bond, built on mutual respect, curiosity, and understanding, continued to grow stronger with each passing day. The love that had begun as a spark at their wedding had transformed into something deeper, more meaningful. Alice had always feared that her silence would stand in the way of connection, but with George, it was nothing but an invitation to explore new depths of intimacy. As their honeymoon period slowly gave way to the routine of married life, Alice and George returned to London. Their return met with mixed reactions. Society had always been quick to judge, and now, with their union still fresh in the minds of the ton, the gossip and scrutiny had only grown more intense. There were those who marveled at the bravery of the Duke in choosing Alice, a woman who could not speak, while others continued to question his motives. Despite the whispers, George's love for Alice remained unshaken. He never wavered in his commitment to her, always by her side, always ready to defend her against the harsh judgments of the world. In public, they were often the subject of stares and whispered conversations, but George stood tall, his hand firmly planted in Alice's, as they navigated the crowded social events and gatherings that filled their calendar. For Alice, the weight of society's judgment was still something she struggled to bear, but with George at her side, it became easier to ignore the cruel whispers. He never allowed the ton's opinions to affect their relationship. When they attended balls or galas, George would often step in front of Alice, shielding her from the onlookers, his presence a constant reminder that her worth was not defined by the judgments of others. Alice, too, began to find peace in her new role as the Duchess of Blackwell ***. The title itself had always felt like a distant thing, something that had belonged to another woman in another life. But now, as George's wife, she was beginning to embrace the responsibilities that came with it. Even if society's expectations weighed heavily on her, she no longer had to hide behind her silence. The Duke had shown her that she could be both strong and silent, and that her value was not in what she could say, but in how she lived and loved. The couple spent their days in quiet companionship, with Alice attending to her duties as the Duchess, hosting charity events, and spending time with George. While their marriage had initially caused a stir, the ton began to see the depth of their connection, and slowly, the whispers began to quiet. Alice had always feared that her silence would keep her from experiencing the love and respect she longed for, but George had proven that love didn't need words. His unwavering support gave her the strength to face the judgment of society with dignity and grace. And as the days passed, Alice realized that she was no longer the woman who had feared rejection. She was the Duchess of Blackwell ***, a woman who had found love not in spite of her silence, but because of it. Their first public appearance as a married couple was at a grand ball hosted by Lady Caroline Whitmore, the same woman who had once spoken so cruelly about Alice's silence. The night was filled with laughter and music, the glittering gowns of the ladies and the immaculate suits of the gentlemen casting a dazzling display in the candlelight. As Alice and George entered the ballroom, all eyes were immediately drawn to them. Some were filled with curiosity, others with disbelief, but none could deny the quiet power of their connection. Alice, dressed in a stunning gown of soft lavender silk with intricate lace detailing, felt the weight of the room's gaze. It was strange, walking into a room that was both familiar and foreign. She had been here before, but never as the Duke's wife, never as the object of such scrutiny. But as she looked up at George, standing tall beside her, his eyes steady and unflinching, she knew that she was not alone. George guided Alice through the room, and as they approached Lady Caroline Alice could feel the woman's eyes narrow with surprise. There was a moment of tension, an electric charge in the air, but George's hand tightened around hers, and he stepped forward with the confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. "Good evening, Lady Whitmore," George said, his voice warm but firm. "I trust you are well?" Lady Caroline's lips curled into a tight smile, though her eyes betrayed a hint of discomfort. "Your Grace," she replied, nodding politely. "And how is the Duchess?" "She is as well as ever," George said, his gaze softening as he looked at Alice. "More than well, I think. My wife is the most remarkable woman I have ever met." Alice's heart fluttered at his words, and she smiled at him, her gaze filled with quiet gratitude. She had spent so long living in the shadows, but now, beside George, she was no longer afraid of the light. As they continued to make their way through the ballroom, the whispers began to fade. Slowly, Alice realized that she was no longer the subject of pity or mockery. She was the Duchess of Blackwell, and she had earned her place in this world not because of her silence, but because of the love she shared with the man at her side. In the days and weeks that followed, society's judgment softened. The couple's bond, forged in the quiet moments of their honeymoon and strengthened by the love they had for one another, became a quiet rebellion against the expectations placed upon them. They had created something that no one could take away, a love that was not defined by titles or opinions, but by the strength of their connection. And in the end, Alice realized that the world's scrutiny no longer mattered. She had found her place beside George, and nothing, no whispered remark, no judgment from the tongue could take away the love they shared. The honeymoon period may have ended, but the journey they had begun together was just beginning, and Alice knew that with George by her side, there was nothing they couldn't face. Chapter 8. The birth of their child. The early days of Alice's marriage to George Harold Duke of Blackwell, had been filled with quiet joy. Their bond, solidified by a love that had defied societal norms, had deepened as the months passed. Yet, despite the peace that had settled into her life, there lingered an undercurrent of fear. Fear that she was somehow still the woman who didn't quite fit into society's neat little boxes. One morning, while walking through the Duke's private library, Alice paused in front of a mirror. She had become accustomed to her new life, to the title she now held, and to the love she shared with George, but there was something else, a quiet, deep feeling of change. It was then that she noticed the subtle shift in her body. Her dress, once comfortably loose, now clung more tightly to her waist. A fleeting wave of nausea passed over her, and she placed a hand over her stomach. It wasn't the first time she had felt a twinge of discomfort, but this was different. The realization came slowly, a delicate thread of understanding weaving through her thoughts. She was pregnant. At first, the thought was surreal, like a dream she had not dared to fully acknowledge. She had always feared that her silence, her deafness, would somehow make her unworthy of motherhood. She had never allowed herself to imagine a future where she could be a mother, where she could raise a child. Yet, here it was a possibility that filled her with both joy and uncertainty. Alice paced the library, her thoughts tumbling over one another. She was overwhelmed by the weight of her discovery. The society she had always feared would view her pregnancy with skepticism, especially at her age. At 24, she was no longer considered a young woman in the eyes of the ton. She had already defied expectations by marrying George, the Duke, a man of impeccable lineage. But now, As a woman of quiet strength and dignity, she wondered if she would ever be able to escape the judgment of society. Would they see her pregnancy as an inconvenience, a flaw, another mark against her because she had waited too long to experience such a joy? As Alice continued to pace, her heart heavy with worry, she heard the familiar sound of George's footsteps in the hall. He entered the room, his face soft with concern, his eyes searching hers. "Alice," he said, his voice gentle, "what's troubling you, my love?" Alice turned toward him, her heart a tangle of emotions. She had always trusted George with her fears, but this was different. She hesitated, unsure how to voice the thoughts that had been plaguing her mind since she realized she was pregnant. I think I might be pregnant," Alice finally said, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke the words out loud. George's expression softened instantly, his eyes warm with understanding. He crossed the room quickly, taking Alice's hands in his. "Alice," he said softly, his voice steady, "this is wonderful news. Why do you look so worried?" Alice's heart pounded, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm happy, George. Truly I am. But I'm also terrified. I'm not sure how society will react. They already see me as the woman who's different, who doesn't fit into their expectations. Now, with this, I fear they'll only judge me more. They'll say I'm too old or that I'm somehow not worthy of motherhood because of my silence." George listened in silence for a moment before gently cupping Alice's face in his hands. His touch was warm, firm, and reassuring. "Alice, listen to me," he said, his voice filled with unwavering sincerity. "You are more than enough. Our child will be a blessing times our time's blessing. I don't care what society thinks or says. They can question our marriage, our love, but they cannot take away our happiness. I love you, Alice, and I will love our child no matter what. There is no one else I would want to have a family with than you. You are strong, you are capable, and you are exactly what our child needs." Tears filled Alice's eyes as she looked up at George, overwhelmed by his words. She had always feared that her silence would make her less than others, but here, in this moment, with George by her side, she realized something she had never allowed herself to believe before. She was worthy. Her silence was not a barrier, it was a part of who she was, a part that had shaped her into the woman George loved. For the first time, Alice allowed herself to feel the joy that had been bubbling inside her. She was not only loved, she was seen, and the life she was about to bring into the world would know nothing but that same love and acceptance. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparations, but amidst the excitement, Alice could not shake the lingering worry that society would continue to scrutinize her, that they would judge her for her age and her silence. Yet, with George's unwavering support, she grew stronger with each passing day. When the time came, Alice found herself surrounded by the warmth and comfort of her home at Blackwell Manor. The house, filled with the scent of lavender and roses, was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of her thoughts. She had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare her for the pain and the anticipation that filled her heart as the first contractions began. George was with her every step of the way. He never left her side, his presence a constant source of comfort. He held her hand through each wave of pain, whispering reassurances in her ear, telling her how strong she was, how proud he was of her. Alice clung to his words, feeling the love and devotion that had always been there, steady and constant. And then, after what felt like an eternity, their son was born. "James Edward Harold," George whispered, tears in his eyes as he cradled their son in his arms for the first time. "Our son." Alice gazed at the tiny face of their newborn son, her heart swelling with a love she had never known. The baby's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, Alice saw in him the same strength she had seen in George. He was perfect, strong and healthy, a symbol of their love and resilience. As Alice held their son in her arms, a wave of relief washed over her. The world outside, with its judgment and its whispers, seemed distant. In this moment, there was only love. Love for George, love for their son, and love for the life they had built together. The news of the birth spread quickly through London, and with it came a mixture of reactions. Society, always quick to judge, had been silent at first. The whispers began. Of course, some still doubted their union, still questioned the legitimacy of their marriage. But as the weeks went by, something changed. Alice was no longer the silent daughter of the Duke. the woman who had been rejected by society for her differences. She was a mother, a wife, and a woman who had proven that love could conquer the constraints placed on her by society. The birth of James Edward Harold, the Duke's son and heir, silenced many of her critics. The child was healthy and strong, and in the eyes of the ton, he was proof of Alice's worth. Even Lady Caroline Whitmore who had once been so critical of Alice, couldn't help but be impressed. At a gathering a few weeks after James's birth, Alice overheard Caroline speaking with one of her friends. "Well, I must admit," Lady Caroline said, her voice carrying in the quiet corner of the room, "the Duke's son is quite a beautiful baby. And Alice, well, she's managed to do what many thought impossible. I can't say I understand it, but I suppose she is more than I gave her credit for." Alice, though still unused to the attention, felt a quiet satisfaction in hearing those words. For the first time, society was beginning to accept her not as the silent woman who had no place in their world, but as a woman who had forged her own path. And for George, this moment was a triumph. He had always known that Alice was more than her silence, that she was more than the world had made her out to be. Their son, James, was a living testament to that truth. In the nursery, Alice and George stood together, watching as the nurse settled their son into his crib. James's small hand curled into a fist, his tiny fingers grasping at the air as if reaching for something just out of reach. Alice's heart swelled with love, and she turned to George, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. George kissed her forehead, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Yes, we did. And I will always be here, Alice. For you, for him. Always." And in that moment, surrounded by their son and the love they had created together, Alice knew that her silence was no longer a barrier. It was a part of who she was, strong, resilient, and capable of so much more than society had ever imagined. The world had doubted her. It had doubted them. But now, with their son in their arms, Alice and George stood victorious. Together, they had created a family, a love story that had defied expectations. And in doing so, they had proven that the greatest strength of all was simply being true to oneself. And as they stood together, watching their son sleep peacefully, Alice knew that this was just the beginning of the life they would build, a life full of love, laughter, and the joy of raising a family built on the foundation of unwavering trust and devotion. Chapter 9. A New Legacy. The sun was setting over the sprawling grounds of Blackwell Manor casting long shadows over the manicured lawns and gardens that had become the backdrop to Alice's new life. It had been several years since that first moment she had entered the world as George Harold's bride, a silent woman caught in the harsh whispers of society's judgment. The world, once so unkind, now seemed to embrace her not for what she had been, but for what she had become. As she stood on the terrace of the manor, watching the final rays of daylight spill across the horizon, Alice could not help but marvel at the transformation that had taken place in her life. She had once been the daughter of the Duke, a woman relegated to the background, a figure of pity in the eyes of the ton, with her silence defining her every action. But now she was Alice Harold the Duchess of Blackwell, a beloved wife and mother, respected by those who had once scorned her. She turned her gaze toward the family portraits that adorned the walls of the grand hall. There were the faces of George's ancestors, ancient dukes and duchesses, their stern expressions frozen in time. And then, beside them, was their family portrait, the portrait of Alice, George, and their son, James Edward Harold, In the portrait, Alice stood tall and confident, her arm draped around George's, and their son nestled between them, his small hand resting on George's shoulder. It was a quiet symbol of the new legacy they had created together. Alice's transformation had been slow and subtle, a process of learning to embrace not just her role as a wife and mother, but as a woman of strength and dignity. She had once feared that her silence would forever set her apart from the world, but she had come to realize that it was her silence that had allowed her to see the world in a way that others could not. She had learned that true strength did not come from words, but from the ability to stand firm in who you were, regardless of the judgments of others. Her heart swelled as she looked down at her son, now 4 years old, playing in the garden with George The laughter of both father and son filled the air, a sound that had become as familiar to her as the quiet hum of the household. She had once feared that she would never be able to give George the family he deserved, that her silence would forever be an obstacle. But now, with James in their arms, she knew that they had created something beautiful, something that no one could take away. The thought made her smile softly, her heart full of gratitude for the life she now had. There had been days when she had doubted herself, when she had wondered if she was truly worthy of George's love. She had feared that society's expectations would tear them apart, that her silence would forever make her an outsider in her own home. But with George by her side, she had found a sense of peace, a sense of belonging that she had never known before. Alice walked toward the garden, her steps light and sure. As she approached George and James, she could see the joy in their faces, the love that radiated between them. It was a love that transcended all expectations, all societal barriers, and Alice knew, in that moment, that their family was the legacy they would leave behind. It was in moments like this, surrounded by the family they had built, that Alice felt the full weight of their journey together. They had defied the expectations of a society that had once written them off, rewriting the rules of what was possible in a marriage. Their love had not been about titles or wealth, but about the deep connection they shared, a connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. George, once the most sought-after bachelor in England, had found in Alice something no one else could offer, a woman who saw him for who he truly was, a woman whose heart was open to him in ways that no one else had been. In turn, Alice had found in George a man who loved her, not in spite of her silence, but because of it. He had shown her that love was not about words or perfection, it was about acceptance, understanding, and the quiet strength that came from standing beside one another through everything life threw their way. Now, as they stood together in the garden, George placed a hand gently on Alice's shoulder, pulling her close. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said softly, his voice filled with quiet pride. Alice nodded, her heart full as she looked up at him. "Yes, we have," she agreed, "and I am grateful for every moment." "Grateful?" George smiled, his eyes sparkling with affection. "I think the word is times blessed, asterisk." Alice laughed softly, the sound filling the air like music. "I suppose you're right," she said, squeezing his hand. "We've been blessed in ways I never thought possible." They stood there for a long moment, watching their son play in the garden. The world seemed still, as though it too recognized the strength of their bond. In that peaceful silence, Alice felt a sense of fulfillment, of contentment, that she had never known before. She had once feared that her silence would always keep her apart from the world, but now she realized that it was her silence that had brought her closer to the people who mattered most. As she turned back to George, she placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. "We've created something beautiful, George," she said softly. "Something that no one can take away from us." George smiled down at her, his expression filled with warmth and love. "Yes, we have," he agreed, "and it's a legacy we'll pass down to our son." Their future, once uncertain, now stretched out before them like an open road. The legacy they would leave behind was not one of titles or wealth, but one of love, a love that had defied all expectations and had proven that true connection could flourish even in the most unlikely of places. They had shown the world that love transcended all boundaries, that it could exist in the quietest of moments, and that silence, far from being a barrier, was a bridge that brought them closer. As the days passed, Alice and George continued to build their life together, a life rooted in love, respect, and mutual understanding. Alice had come into her own, shedding the doubts and fears that had once held her back. She was no longer the silent woman in the shadows. She was the Duchess of Blackwell, a woman whose strength, dignity, and love had redefined what was possible. The whispers of society, the doubts that had once surrounded their union, had faded into the background, replaced by the quiet admiration of those who had come to see the depth of their connection. The Duke and Duchess of Blackwell were no longer the subjects of gossip, but the embodiment of a love that had overcome the harshest of judgments. Alice had found her place in the world, and in the eyes of George and their son, she had found the greatest treasure of all, the knowledge that she was truly seen. She had come from the shadows, from a life of silence, and now she stood at the forefront of a legacy that was built on love, a love that would continue to grow, to thrive, and to inspire for generations to come. As the sun set on another peaceful evening at Blackwell Manor, Alice stood beside George, watching their son run through the garden, his laughter filling the air. The world around them had changed, and so had they. Together, they had built a life that was more than they had ever dreamed, of a life full of love, family, and purpose. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Alice knew that this was only the beginning. Their legacy, born from a love that had defied all odds, would live on, a testament to the power of love, acceptance, and the strength that came from being true to oneself. In the quiet of the night, with George by her side, Alice felt more certain than ever that they had created something that would endure. Their love, their family, and their legacy would carry on, forever unbroken. Thank you for joining Alice and George on their extraordinary journey of love, transformation, and defying societal expectations. If you've been moved by their story, please leave a review and share your thoughts. Let us know how Alice's journey has inspired you to embrace your own strength, love, and authenticity. Don't forget to share this story with others who might need a reminder that love knows no boundaries. Stay connected for more heartwarming stories and updates on future releases. Your support helps us bring more stories to life, stories that prove true love conquers all.